Representatives of the NFL, Major League Baseball, the NBA, and the NHL talked today about what pro sports leagues are doing to address the issue of domestic violence. Witnesses from professional athletes' unions also testified. This hearing of the Senate Commerce Committee is 2.5 hours. It begins with Committee Chair Senator Jay Rockefeller.
The hearing will come to order. Sports have always played a huge role, culturally and otherwise, in the United States. Just last week on Thanksgiving, millions of Americans were probably paying more attention to their TV sets than to their turkeys. It's part of our cultural deal. I hope it's a good one. Athletes have become icons in America. I remember at that time, 10-year-old son had this gigantic poster of Ray Nitschke. It took up half his room. But that's the way it was then. He's now 45. That's the way it was then. It's the way it is now. Whether we like it or not, Major League athletes serve as role models for our youth. Generations of children have grown up watching sporting events with their parents. It's a family affair. And game day traditions have been handed down from generation to the next. Of course, just literally, it's an amazing American phenomenon. Kids wear the jerseys of their favorite players. They have their posters, and they collect their cards, most of which are not charged for, I guess. But it's an amazing figure. And it's one that we want to talk about. Given this reality, I hope we can skip protestations about how domestic violence is a larger societal problem and not unique to sports. That we often get that. You should know that this committee, it's not known by most, but this committee has complete and absolute jurisdiction, that is oversight over all sports at all levels. And we have exercised it with college sports, the NCAA, and we're today doing it through the courtesy of your presence. Of course, it's a societal problem, and it's a grievous one, and it's kind of come upon us really fast in terms of public awareness and the coverage of it. But as a nation, we have a responsibility to collectively and aggressively address this terrible problem. We all do, you, we. But given the high-profile nature of professional sports, when a celebrity athlete is charged with committing a domestic violence, it uniquely reverberates through our society in fascinating ways. And because professional sports enjoy unique benefits bestowed upon them by the public, such as public funds for stadiums or exemptions from antitrust laws, it's entirely proper for this committee to focus its attention on how professional sports leagues and their unions are handling the problem of domestic violence within their ranks. At today's hearing, I want to learn what the 4 major professional sports leagues and their players' associations are doing to address this problem, and we really do want to find out. I want to know if you're developing uniform policies that will effectively and appropriately punish players who commit what are criminal acts against women and children. I want to learn what the leagues can already do with their existing authorities. The NFL comes to mind on that. And what must be the subject of new collective bargaining, which may be more popular with some than with others. I also want to be clear, the problem of domestic violence in professional sports is not a problem unique to the NFL. The NFL has made most of the headlines in recent months, both for shocking and high-profile incidents and for the league's controversial response. All of the professional sports leagues represented here today, however, have a problem with athletes or employees who have committed violent criminal acts, all of them. And I can give them to you if you try to deny it. Until very recently, the league's records have not been good. There's a long list of players in the NFL, the NBA, the NHL, and Major League Baseball who have been charged with, and in some cases convicted of, domestic violence, and the leagues have done little or nothing in response. In fact, the press has reported that a culture of silence within the leagues often prevents victims from reporting their abuse to law enforcement. This has to change. There are reasons for that, financial, et cetera. The culture of silence is because in most cases the athlete being male, the wife doesn't want to give up the salary, and all of these things come into it. But it has to stop, and that's what we're here for, to talk about it and to move forward. My very excellent co-chair here, Senator Thune.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing to discuss the serious issue of domestic violence in professional sports. And let me just say that I'm that 10-year-old kid that you're talking about growing up, just aspired to, admired, idolized professional athletes. And I grew up in a small town in South Dakota of 800 people where we didn't get a newspaper until the following day. And so you didn't, you didn't get box scores, you got line scores to follow your baseball players. And we got one television channel. And so we got the CBS affiliate. In some places that's true. And so, you know, I got to watch the Green Bay Packers twice a year, and that was the 2 times they played the Minnesota Vikings in the divisional. But that was my team, and because we only got one television station, that's all we had. And you know, we didn't have a lot of the apparel that they now have, so I'd take a white T-shirt and I'd take a blue felt pen and put 32 on there, and the LA Dodgers for Sandy Koufax, and I wore that. And my younger brother I was a big Bart Starr fan. He was a Roger Staubach fan. But I tell you all that by way of background just to indicate, I think, all of us in this country have a tremendous, you know, admiration for people who succeed at that level. And it is incredible influence and power that people who are successful in professional sports have on young people in this country. And young people are watching, and that whether they like it or not, the people who have those positions are role models, and certainly we hope good ones. But I just wanted to, and that's why I think this domestic violence issue that's been brought to our attention here of late and entered into the national discussion is so important. As a father of 2 daughters, I found the graphic security camera footage of running back Ray Rice and his then fiance to be sickening, like so many others did across this country. And I think the NFL's initial response to this matter was completely inadequate. A 2-game suspension was a paltry sentence for such violent behavior. At best, the NFL failed to understand the scope and severity of the incident. At worst, by waiting to suspend Mr. Rice only after the elevator video was made public, the NFL sent a mixed message to millions of fans and the general public about how it handles such acts of violence. And of course, as you mentioned, this isn't unique to professional football. We're going to hear today that every league has experienced similar acts of violence by their respective players over the years. I'm troubled by the recent remarks of the Commissioner of Baseball that seem to downplay the extent of the problem within his sport. Rather than minimizing the issue, I believe the correct approach is for the leagues to engage in meaningful talks with their players' unions and other stakeholders to ensure player conduct policies are sufficient when such acts of violence are carried out. And that may mean renegotiating certain contract provisions and strengthening penalties where appropriate. Questions of due process, such as determining if, when, and how a player should be disciplined, are also an important part of this conversation. But this is a conversation that needs to take place because, sadly, this issue isn't going away anytime soon. And while I'm encouraged to hear that in many of the leagues represented here today, the conversation has begun, we should be working toward a consistent policy when it comes to such acts of violence. Violence of any kind, but particularly against women and children, is simply unacceptable. It is my hope that today's hearing will shed some light on what professional sports leagues are doing to address these issues, and if, as many believe, the current policies of the national sports leagues are insufficient to address these concerns in an adequate and equitable manner, I'm hopeful that today's hearing will put pressure on the leagues and the players' unions to make whatever changes are necessary to ensure that such acts of violence are addressed swiftly and perpetrators are disciplined appropriately. As Chairman, in the past, we've used our jurisdiction in this area to examine a number of issues, ranging from steroids in sports to protecting children from concussions. Often when we turn our attention to issues involving professional sports, questions are raised about whether it's the best use of our time and resources. For instance, in 2005, this committee held a series of hearings to examine the policies of Major League Baseball concerning the use of steroids. I wasn't on the committee at that time, but I'm aware of some of the headlines that these hearings generated, including those that called the steroid hearings a waste of time and money. But, Mr. Chairman, as a result of those hearings, something remarkable happened. Major League Baseball turned the corner from its sordid so-called steroid era and implemented a series of sweeping reforms that we're still witnessing. Our committee's ability to shine a bright light on problems in the world of sports is often all it takes to induce real and meaningful change, and we've been able to do so without changes in federal law. So I believe this hearing is important. Questions surrounding how professional sports leagues address domestic violence are valid ones and rightly warrant scrutiny by this committee. Professional athletes and the teams they play for are, for better or worse, role models and opinion makers. What they do to combat this unacceptable behavior can help set an example, especially for the youngsters who grow up watching them. And while I thank the witnesses for being here today and sharing your testimony, it's disappointing that the league commissioners are not here to speak for their sports. It's also unfortunate that, with the notable exception of the NBA Players Association, the heads of the other players' associations are not here today. These are issues that are not and should not be partisan, and it may very well be appropriate for the committee to revisit this topic in the next Congress to assess the progress of the leagues and the Players Association in dealing with domestic violence. Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator. Now we're going to have something that we don't usually do, but we're going to today. The chair of the relevant subcommittee, Claire McCaskill, will speak for 2 minutes, I do believe, and be followed by Senator Heller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this important hearing. The bright light of public attention needs to be turned on at a very high wattage on a problem that exists in the shadows in a very dark and scary place. With great power and influence comes great responsibility, and no one will debate that probably the leagues you represent here today have more power and influence in our country than maybe any other institutions that I can think of. Professional sports must do a better job of setting an example to young people and victims of domestic violence who face very difficult decisions as they struggle with holding their abusers accountable. Professional sports, with very few exceptions, have done little to hold those who commit this crime accountable. And perpetrators know that if they can only get their victims to recant, refuse to cooperate, threaten their financial future, threaten the future of their family's financial status, or put them on an airplane to Venezuela, if they can accomplish those things, then nothing will happen. There has been little or no effort to independently get the facts. Rather, just use the predictable outcome that very few who are abused will have an adequate support system within the families of the professional sports teams where they exist to get the support to come forward and hold their abuser accountable. And so, by and large, professional sports teams have relied on the failure of the criminal justice system to get convictions as their excuse as to why no players or very few players have been held accountable. I'm anxious to hear how you view your responsibility to independently gather the facts and hold the professional athletes that commit these crimes accountable with sanctions within your leagues. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Heller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the committee's attention to this important issue. I didn't realize till this hearing that Nevada was so advanced because we had 3 channels, 3 television channels, able to watch our Warriors, our San Francisco 49ers, and the Giants play. So anyway, I know that there are some here in this room that may question why Congress is involved in this issue, and I'd like to explain why. Every minute in the United States, 20 people will experience domestic violence. Last night, more than 20,000 phone calls were made to domestic violence hotlines. 1 in 3 women will experience physical violence from a partner sometime in their lifetime. Children exposed to domestic violence are more likely to commit domestic violence later in life. As a husband, a father of 2 wonderful daughters, this is simply unacceptable and something that must be changed. These numbers aren't just statistics, they're people. Their wives, their mothers, daughters, their sisters, and their friends. The witnesses before us today represent the most popular and commercially successful sports leagues in the world. Their star players are household names and role models for fans and aspiring young athletes. In the past few years, we've witnessed some truly shocking acts from some of these public figures. But just as concerning is how the league handles these situations and how the unions protect these players. It's very clear to me that getting these players back on the field was more important than addressing incidences of sexual assault, domestic violence, or even child abuse. The leagues and the unions simply brushed these problems aside and left it to the courts. Only when a video surfaced of the brutal punch an NFL player landed on his fiancée did the collective conscience of America demand these leagues and unions change their approach. I can only imagine what survivors feel like today. As I wrote in a letter earlier this year to NFL Commissioner Roger Goodell, by waiting until the video of a shocking act of domestic violence by one of their players became public, they effectively condoned the actions of this player. I believe the same holds true for the Players Association. In fact, I don't think you even understand the full scope of the problem. When the Ray Rice decision was overturned, the NFL Players Association said this decision is a victory for disciplinary process that is fair and transparent. This union will always stand up and fight for the due process of our players. This is not about due process. This is not about collective bargaining agreements you do not like anymore or want to change. This is not about any type of labor issues you may have with the league. This is about helping to stop a terrible problem in society. Wives, mothers, sisters, daughters, and friends are being beaten. When you're worrying more about getting back on the field instead of stopping abuse, your priorities are out of order. Instead of addressing the problem, inadequate or non-existent league policies and codes of conduct mean that aggressors have not been dealt with appropriately, and the survivors of domestic violence have been left behind. There's no place in any society for these horrifying acts of domestic violence and sexual assault. Our nation's professional sport leagues have a unique ability to make a difference. The American people need you to step up, and this committee wants to know what you're going to do to take a stand. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. We go now to the witness list. Again, I express our appreciation for your being here. And we'll start with Mr. Troy Vincent, who's Executive Vice President of Football Operations at the National Football League. Welcome.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, my name is Troy Vincent. I'm the Executive Vice President of Football Operations at the National Football League. I'm pleased to discuss the work we have underway at the NFL to address conduct standards, including domestic violence and sexual assault. We want to set the highest standards for personal behavior in order to meet the expectations of our fans, players, and those of the general broader public. In 2007, Commissioner Goodell issued an enhanced personal conduct policy for all players, owners, and league employees. But as recent events made clear, we have not kept our standards current with our own values. We've made mistakes. We've been humbled. We accept the criticism we've received, and we are committed to being part of this solution. We will get this right. Mr. Chairman and committee, when I consider these issues, I bring a perspective far beyond an NFL executive. Domestic violence was a way of life in my home growing up. My brother and I watched helplessly numerous times as my mother was beaten and knocked unconscious as we dialed 911. We saw how she struggled to seek help and find the courage to say no more. The fear and the complexities accompanying this violence remain very real in my life today. I've committed my life work for the last 20 years as an advocate against domestic violence in an effort to keep others from experiencing this lifetime pain. I relate to the 20 million victims, survivors of domestic violence, sexual abuse in every community across our great nation. In addition, I had the honor and the privilege of playing in the National Football League for 15 years. 12 of those years I served as a union official. 4 of those years I served as the Players Association president. I support the interest of all players in a fair process. I led these efforts. I know the majority of our current and former players are terrific husbands, fathers, and men who have made incredible contributions into their communities. Mr. Chairman, players know that league standards are not labor issues nor management issues. They're issues that concern everyone. In 2007, the league and the players union worked closely together, collaborated in developing a personal conduct policy. I was part of those efforts. And today, just as in the past, the league has invited the NFLPA, along with other experts, to assist us in setting the highest possible standards. The NFL is taking a number of steps to improve how we respond to incidents of domestic violence, child abuse, and sexual assault. First, through efforts personally led by the commissioner, the NFL has undertaken a thorough review of our personal conduct policy, having consulted with over 100 leading experts across a broad range of subjects. Our goal is to set clear rules to govern accountability for misconduct, to establish a fair process for our players and employee discipline. We will create a conduct committee responsible for review and recommend changes to the personal conduct policy going forward. Experts will continue to advise both the conduct committee and the commissioner so that we always have the right voices at the table on both educational and disciplinary work. Second, we are deploying a comprehensive mandatory education program for more than 5,000 men and women in the NFL family. Our goal is to ensure that everyone understands and has the full scope of this behavior and is familiar with the warning signs associated with these crimes. Education also promotes prevention, bystander intervention, how individuals can appropriately and safely help those at risk is another key focus area of our education. Third, we are training critical response teams to help prevent and respond quickly to family violence and sexual assault, including safety, medical, legal, and financial support. Fourth, we are supporting leading domestic violence and sexual assault awareness and prevention groups, including the National Domestic Violence Hotline and the National Sexual Violence Resource Center. Fifth, and finally, we're raising awareness of this critical issue: domestic violence, child abuse, and sexual assault. In collaboration with the No More campaign and the Joyful Heart Foundation, the NFL is airing public service announcements during our game. Finally, we're promoting programs for those who play, coach, and manage our game at all levels, including age-appropriate character development, healthy relationship education, as well as dating violence, domestic violence, child abuse, and sexual assault education. We've learned a great deal from our mistakes, and by listening to experts in the domestic violence, child abuse, and the sexual assault communities, the more we've listened, the more we've learned and become more aware of these complexities, both of the problem and the solution. We're working hard to balance the issues of a fair process with the goal of preventing and punishing these behaviors. Mr. Chairman and the committee, we believe that wearing the uniform of an NFL player is a privilege. It is not a right. Every member of the NFL community must embrace this unique leadership role that we play in our society and the trust that you place in us. We look forward to working with the committee to advance these goals I know we all share. Thank you for this opportunity. And Chairman, I thank you for your lifetime service in this area.
Thank you, Mr. Vincent. There was excellent testimony and honest, and it's a good beginning. Thank you. Ms. Terry Patterson, Deputy Managing Director, National Football League Players Association.
Sir. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman.
Can you put that closer to your...
Certainly. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. As stated, my name is Terry Patterson, and I serve as the Deputy Managing Director and Special Counsel of the NFL Players Association, whom I represent on the panel today. We greatly appreciate the committee's interest in the critical issue of domestic violence. We always welcome the opportunity to meet with any members of the committee to discuss the issues concerning our sport. We've seen in the past that the leadership of elected officials brought thoughtful and meaningful change to our sport, for example, in the area of concussions. We've worked with and supported members of this committee as they continue to push for better standards to protect athletes that participate in football on all levels. We're here today to address your concerns surrounding domestic violence in professional sports. Just to be clear, neither our players nor the NFLPA condone domestic violence in any form. We understand the significance of our position, both for society at large and, more importantly, for the families and individuals involved. Any incident of domestic violence by any player is one too many, but it does not and should not reflect on the overwhelming majority of our members who contribute to their communities in countless ways. This week, for example, you'll see players out in the community with many of your constituents and their children as part of the Play 60 campaign. We believe that a comprehensive system of education, prevention, intervention, and counseling will help us find solutions to lowering the instances of domestic violence that present themselves each and every year. Specifically related to our sport, we believe that those tools combined with fair and appropriate discipline is the best way to achieve the goals of preventing incidents of domestic violence and assisting those involved. Unfortunately, we've seen repeated instances where discipline under the personal conduct policy of the NFL, implemented unilaterally by its commissioner, has failed to get us closer to those solutions. We've seen on more than one occasion when disciplinary matters are left solely to the NFL, the process is mismanaged, and often the end result has not been able to withstand outside review. For example, in the Bounty incident in New Orleans, the commissioner's unilaterally imposed discipline was overturned not only by a system arbitrator, but also by a former NFL commissioner who was tasked with reviewing the NFL's actions. In the more recently imposed discipline of Ray Rice, the commissioner's arbitrary discipline was also overturned after further review by a former federal judge appointed as the neutral arbitrator. This current system, run unilaterally by the NFL, simply does not work. It does not work for our members, and we've heard from your constituents as well, as I'm sure you have, that continue to express distrust and displeasure in the current system of discipline. So we've been tasked by our membership of players to find solutions and to collectively bargain with the NFL for a better process. Accordingly, in early October of this year, we established a Blue Ribbon Commission to advise us on matters of domestic violence prevention, intervention, and processes of discipline. I've included the names of the members of the commission in the submitted testimony and also their bios. We are also fortunate and pleased to see that a member of our NFLPA Commission, Ms. Virginia Seitz, is testifying at the hearing today. With the assistance of experts and community leaders, we've started a meaningful dialogue with our membership on ways to create programming and policy to address these societal issues. We requested that the NFL join with us in appointing the members of the Commission and participating in the Commission's work. The NFL has declined to do so to date, but that did not stop us from moving ahead. But we cannot move ahead in bargaining by ourselves. We've attempted to engage the league in informal negotiations and bargaining to improve the personal conduct policy and the processes by which it is to be administered. We provided the NFL with a fair proposal over a month ago, and despite the receipt of a letter response only this past Sunday, the NFL still refuses to commit to collective bargaining. We believe that a jointly bargained system is the only way to ensure that professional football's approach to the issue of domestic violence has the credibility and effectiveness that the fans, the sports business partners, and our players have come to expect and respect, such as our comprehensive drug-related policies. We remain fully committed to addressing these issues in a meaningful way because that's the only way we can ensure that change happens. We also remain ready to assist any members of the committee in improving the way domestic violence is addressed in our sport and in our country. Thank you again for your time, and we look forward to answering any questions you may have for us.
Thank you very much, Ms. Patterson. I just have to note at this point that there was an enormous amount of pressure coming from many directions, not necessarily the folks at the witness table, but the folks that you work with, for us not to have this hearing. We went ahead anyway. So not everything is, this openness is not as commonly held a process as I would like. Mr. Joe Torre, who's Executive Vice President of Baseball Operations for Major League Baseball. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon. Chairman Rockefeller, Senator Thune, and members of the committee. I'm Joe Torre, Executive Vice President of Baseball Operations for Major League Baseball, and I want to thank you for the opportunity to discuss the efforts we are undertaking to address the issue of domestic violence and sexual assault. The subject matter of this hearing is personally important to me. As a person whose childhood was touched by domestic violence, I have come to understand that discussing the issue publicly has the potential to help millions of victims who believe that they must suffer in silence. In 2002, my wife Allie and I formed the Safe at Home Foundation to create educational programs aimed at ending the cycle of domestic violence. And I'm proud to say that we've reached close to 50,000 youngsters in that time. Through my work in this area, including co-chairing the Attorney General's Task Force on Children Exposed to Violence, I have had the opportunity to work with some truly outstanding individuals who have devoted their lives to working towards solving the issue of domestic violence in this country. Commissioner Seelig has instilled in our sport the understanding that Major League Baseball is a social institution, and as our national pastime, has an obligation to set a positive example. The Commissioner and I deplore domestic violence and crimes against women and families. We recognize the clear public expectation for the professional sport leagues to be leaders in addressing this social ill. Some of our clubs already have taken a leading role in this issue. For example, the Seattle Mariners have partnered with Washington State Coalition Against Domestic Violence on a statewide educational initiative called Refuse to Abuse. Going forward, the Commissioner has instructed his staff to develop a standalone policy to address domestic violence and sexual assault prior to the upcoming season. Although we are in the midst of developing this policy, I would like to explain to the committee what we have done thus far and what we hope to do in the next few months. Since September of 2014, as part of our education process, representatives of Major League Baseball have met with over a dozen national and local organizations focused on addressing domestic violence and violence against women or providing services and support to victims. Representatives from those groups consistently told us that while they are obviously unsettled by the recent incidents of domestic violence in professional sports, they believe that those incidents have shined a light on an issue often in the shadows. They believe, and we agree, that sports leagues can make a difference. We have begun selecting a variety of organizations to serve on a joint MLB-PA steering committee that will develop education and training materials for players, staff, and their families. Some of these initiatives include posting informational materials at Major League and minor league ballparks and publicizing contact information for confidential hotlines and shelters. MLB intends to develop educational programs at each club specifically designed for the families and intimate partners of players. We also are developing protocols that our clubs must follow in response to domestic violence or sexual assault incidents that will include appropriate measures to ensure the safety of affected individuals, providing confidential counseling and treatment for victims, and providing counseling and intervention for perpetrators. Major League Baseball has selected a San Francisco-based group called Futures Without Violence to help us develop and implement training and education programs for all of our players. Futures has been partnering with the San Francisco Giants on these important issues for more than a decade. Futures has arranged for Dr. Linda Chamberlain to speak with the medical staffs of our clubs at MLB's winter meetings in San Diego this coming weekend. Dr. Chamberlain founded the Alaska Family Violence Prevention Project and will be speaking to our club medical staffs on a trauma-informed approach to addressing domestic violence. In January of 2015, the top prospects in baseball will be educated on domestic violence and sexual assault during MLB's annual Rookie Career Development Program. Beginning with MLB spring training this February, every major and minor league player will be educated on issues relating to domestic violence and sexual assault by Futures and other organizations, including Mentors in Violence Prevention, Men Can Stop Rape, A Call to Men, and Casa de Esperanza. The staffs of MLB clubs and the Commissioner's office will also be educated. The Commissioner understands that an important component of any policy covering domestic violence and sexual assault is appropriate discipline for players who engage in this conduct. Presently, the Commissioner has the authority under MLB's collective bargaining agreement with the Players Association to discipline players for just cause, for conduct that is materially detrimental or materially prejudicial to the best interest of baseball, including but not limited to engaging in conduct in violation of federal, state, or local law. Under a just cause standard, the Commissioner's office is required to prove a violation by a player at an evidentiary hearing before a neutral arbitrator, which can be difficult in the absence of a conviction or a plea, or without cooperating witnesses or tangible evidence regarding the conduct. In addition, our arbitrators in the past have been less inclined to uphold severe discipline under a just cause standard for off-field conduct that does not impact the player's ability to perform. MLB has proposed revisions to its disciplinary policy covering MLB players that would make it easier for the Commissioner to impose an appropriate level of discipline on players who commit acts of domestic violence or sexual assault and have that discipline be upheld in arbitration. MLB does not have the right to insist on any changes to player discipline until its current collective bargaining agreement with the Players Association expires in December of 2016. However, we are hopeful that we will come to an agreement with the Players Association prior to the start of next season on a disciplinary policy specifically tailored to domestic violence and sexual assault. As we told our owners 2 weeks ago, Major League Baseball is committed to developing a culture in which its athletes implicitly understand their moral obligation as both men and role models to speak out and act against crimes against women and families. We fully understand that educating over 4,000 players from diverse backgrounds on an issue that many of them have not previously considered is not an easy undertaking. However, we intend to devote the time and the resources necessary to accomplish just that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Torrey. It was my mistake that I did not say at the beginning of this hearing that we face two challenges. One, we have generally a rule that witnesses can speak for 5 minutes or less, but not more. And secondly, we have votes starting at 4 o'clock. So that puts pressure on all of us to get on with it. Ms. Virginia Seitz, outside counsel, Major League Baseball Players Association. What is outside counsel? Are you a part of them, or do you advise them, or what?
I advise them, and I've been doing it for the past 25 years. I've been outside special counsel for most of the last 25 years to Major League Baseball Players Association.
But they couldn't make it.
Well, I'm testifying on behalf of the association's executive director, Tony Clark. He couldn't attend today because he is right now chairing MLBPA's annual executive board meeting. And it will not be surprise you to hear that one of the major topics at that meeting that's under discussion today and tomorrow is, in fact, domestic violence and the work the association's been doing this fall to address domestic
Please proceed
violence.
with your testimony and the time.
I will attempt to be brief.
Yeah, you don't need to be. That time is mine. You have your full 5 minutes.
Okay. This fall, the Players Association has been working with Major League Baseball to examine our current program addressing domestic violence, which only covers players, in light of recent events. We've been considering how it needs to be modified and perhaps folded into a program for the entire baseball family that's based on accountability, consequences, and fairness. Back in 2011, the Players Association and Major League Baseball negotiated and implemented a policy that addresses off-field violent conduct, including domestic violence, in 2 ways. It provides for both therapeutic intervention and for discipline in cases of inappropriate and unlawful conduct. With respect to the first, under our joint treatment program, we utilize medical professionals all around the country to design therapeutic treatments for players who are charged with domestic violence-related crimes. Based on our understanding of domestic violence, we had moved away from a one-size-fits-all approach in favor of individualized evaluation and case-by-case treatment for the player and the family involved. With respect to discipline, as Mr. Torrey described, the program gives the commissioner of baseball or the employer club authority to discipline a player where an act of domestic violence has been alleged. Under the collective bargaining agreement, a player may be disciplined for just cause for any conduct materially detrimental or materially prejudicial to the best interests of baseball, including any conduct that violates federal, state, or local law. It's critically important from the association's point of view that discipline be imposed for just cause and that it be subject to review before a neutral arbitrator. In addition to the program just described, the association maintains its own clinical psychiatrist on staff. He's well-known and frequently meets with players on a confidential basis to address mental health issues as they arise and that might lead to violence. This part of the association's program reflects its belief that the most effective treatment is that what happens before violence can occur. In sum, our current program involves, under which our current program, a player may be disciplined, may undergo treatment developed by licensed professionals, and may seek help through our own clinical psychiatrist. We recognize, however, that more can be done, and so this fall we have begun a dialogue with MLB about modifications and improvements to our program. That includes an enhanced public relations program to promote the understanding and eradication of domestic violence in our society. Second, an improved education and therapeutic program for Major League Baseball players and their families so that potential issues can be addressed in an appropriate, confidential manner before violence occurs, and so that all are aware of resources that can provide assistance and prevent harm. And third, possible changes to the existing disciplinary structure for domestic violence offenses. Like many organizations, MLBPA has devoted an extraordinary amount of time and effort this fall to consulting with a wide range of experts and expert organizations in the domestic violence area. We have learned that there's no one simple solution, no one easy answer, but we hope that by working with the experts and gathering their recommendations, we can develop a more effective program for all of baseball and become a credible voice in the ongoing national dialogue about how to end domestic violence. Mr. Chairman, thank you for this opportunity. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you very much, Ms. Seitz. Ms. Kathleen Behrens, Executive Vice President, Social Responsibility and Player Programs, the National Basketball Association. Please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Senator Thune, and members of the committee. Appreciate your inviting us to this hearing today. My written testimony has been submitted to the committee, so I will certainly try to be brief in the interest of time. We share your view, however, that a hearing like this is certainly helpful and expect that it will generate not only thought but action, and that can certainly help all of us at this table. I am the NBA's Executive Vice President for Social Responsibility and Player Programs, and as such I oversee all of our community programs and partnerships, as well as all of our educational efforts with our players. Our Commissioner, Adam Silver, regrets that he is not able to be here today, but he had a long-standing commitment to lead a group of NBA owners and executives on a trip to India this week. Like the committee, and like others already have spoken, we have taken a fresh look at all of our programs, policies, and educational efforts in this area over the course of the last few months. And we have determined through our work, especially in partnership with the Players Association, that there is more that we can and should be doing to better educate our players and to help prevent domestic violence from occurring in the first place. We work closely with the Players Association on all of our educational programs for players and have determined that this year we need to do even more. We'll be doing new awareness and educational sessions with our players, with player family members, with team and league staff to help raise awareness, inspire leadership, and hopefully prevent domestic violence from happening within the NBA family. At the same time, we know that discipline is part of the process as well, and our collective bargaining agreement allows for discretion for the commissioner, but also neutral arbitration for our players, due process that we believe is fair. In the end, we want to stress to this committee and to others that we take this issue seriously. We are committed to doing all that we can to prevent it. We are committed to doing all that we can to provide firm but fair discipline when necessary. And we will continue to learn and improve in all of these areas. Happy to answer any questions that the committee has. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Ms. Michelle Roberts is the Executive Director, NBA Players Association. Welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman. And is my mic on? I can't tell. Now it's on.
Beautiful.
Okay, great. Again, my name is Michelle Roberts, and I am the Executive Director of the National Basketball Players Association, the labor union that represents all NBA players in collective bargaining. I appreciate the committee's desire to explore the topic of domestic violence in professional sports. As a lawyer, formerly in private practice with the law firm of Skadden Arps, my most rewarding pro bono project involved the representations of victims of violence, of domestic violence, who were seeking civil protection orders in local courts right here in D.C. When I began work at the NBPA as executive director in mid-September, I was encouraged to learn that domestic violence is a topic that our players recognized needed to be addressed long before the events of recent months, when the public's attention has turned so intently on the subject. Recent events have given us an opportunity to re-examine and strengthen the already comprehensive scheme the NBA and the NBPA had in place, and add even more safeguards with a focus on prevention and counseling. We want to make sure that every player, wife, significant other, and family member has a safe environment to seek help without fear of retaliation or additional harm. And in doing so, our recent efforts have brought together representatives of all members of the NBA family in an unprecedented fashion. We also want to lead by example and help create the kind of awareness and attention that this prevalent and society-wide problem deserves. Let me first step back, though, to briefly describe some of the steps our players had already taken through collective bargaining and otherwise to address these issues. I do not exaggerate when I say that we begin to broach this topic with our players years before they even enter the NBA. Each June at our Top 100 camp, the NBPA brings together the nation's elite high school basketball players together with their parents and helps prepare them for competitive life at the next level with an emphasis on character, education, and life skills development. Close to 200 current NBA players have attended the Top 100 camp. During this week-long program at the University of Virginia campus, the players work on their basketball skills, but the majority of each day is focused away from the court, where our staff of retired players, counselors, psychologists, and psychiatric professionals lead large and small group discussions that, in part, focus specifically on respect issues with girls and women. At this young and impressionable age, we teach players that part of embracing their manhood includes treating every woman with kindness and respect. At last June's camp, the boys and their parents spent a great deal of time with Kalima Johnson, a very effective educator and founder of the Sasha Center, a Detroit-based healing and awareness center focusing on sexual assault. The education continues the moment a player enters the league with the Rookie Transition Program, a 4-day joint program between labor and management that likewise focuses on personal skills development and provides training on numerous topics related to conduct, including domestic violence. In past years, Judge Glenda Hatchett has been a very effective voice, delivering graphic and powerful presentations on the effects and consequences of sexual misconduct and abuse of women. To complete the progression, we not only raise awareness for our players before and upon entering the NBA, but we now hold a team awareness meeting designed jointly by the NBA and NBPA, devoted solely to the topic of domestic violence. As we speak, Kalima Johnson, whom I mentioned earlier, and Ted Bunch, a co-founder of A Call to Men, a leading violence prevention organization, are traveling around the country to meet with every NBA team for a session devoted solely to domestic violence awareness. These sessions supplement the year-round work done by our NBPA player program staff, a group of 7 retired players who work full-time for the union, together with the joint labor management, player assistance, and health education programs that help players confront many of the emotional anger management and other stress-related issues that can be at the root of a domestic conflict. Our collective bargaining agreement itself specifically lays out various policies designed to prevent, deter, and if necessary, punish acts of domestic violence. Under our uniform player contract, players are required to conduct themselves on and off the court according to the high standards of honesty, citizenship, and sportsmanship. And the commissioner may impose a fine or suspension for conduct that does not conform to standards of morality or fair play, that does not comply at all times with all federal, state, and local laws, or that is prejudicial or detrimental to the NBA. And let me, because I see I'm running out of time, end on this note, on this final note. Here it is. Since I began my tenure, I have determined that in addition to the CBA-mandated levels of discipline, a greater focus is warranted on prevention and services to family members. At the union's expense, I recently convened a group of NBA mothers, fathers, spouses, and significant others for an all-day session at our offices in New York. Those discussions were facilitated by a domestic violence expert, Karma Kotman, with the DC Coalition Against Domestic Violence. And among other things, we identified as a principal need the establishment of a hotline and counseling service that will encourage not just players, but family members and other interested persons to seek out help without the fear of retaliation. Many people are fearful that if they speak out about the possibility or the actual occurrence of a domestic violence event, they will expose themselves to public ridicule, be alienated by relatives and friends, and or jeopardize a player's livelihood and thus put at risk their family's financial health. Everyone must be comfortable that there is a safe and confidential manner to seek help. And with that and the passage of now of 6 minutes and 14 seconds, I'll conclude my presentation, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. Jessica Berman, who is Vice President and Deputy General Counsel of the National Hockey League. Welcome.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Chairman, Ranking Member, and the members of the committee for inviting the National Hockey League to testify here today regarding domestic violence in professional sports. The NHL takes very seriously the issues of domestic violence. We believe we have an obligation to raise awareness, provide education, and penalize offenders, all with the hope and intention of deterring future misconduct. To that end, and working with the NHLPA, the duly authorized collective bargaining representative of all NHL players, the league has responsibly developed, implemented, and enforced strict policies, practices, and procedures regulating the off-ice personal conduct of its players, which extend to and encompass situations of domestic abuse. A core component underlying these rules and policies is a comprehensive education program, which has existed for at least the last decade. The league provides annual training for our players on a variety of critical social issues, and these issues have included domestic abuse. This training and education has been delivered in a number of forms and contexts and by multiple voices. Those voices have included the NHL Security Department and medical professionals charged with administering our substance abuse and behavioral health program, which is a jointly administered program created by the NHL and NHLPA in 1996. They meet with players on an annual basis on each team to discuss with them, among other things, personal conduct issues. In addition, the NHL and NHLPA organize an annual rookie orientation program, and at this past year's program, at 2 different breakout sessions, the issue of domestic violence was addressed, as well as other personal conduct issues. We believe that by making the message clear and reinforcing them on a regular basis, the players are better prepared to appreciate and manage difficult problems that they face, both from a personal and professional standpoint. And as a result, they will be better equipped to avoid situations that will bring harm to themselves and to their families. In addition to our work in the area of education and raising awareness, the collective bargaining agreement, which will remain in effect until at least September 15, 2020, governs the terms and conditions of employment for all NHL players. The CBA grants both the league and each of its 30 clubs the authority to enforce the rules regulating players' personal off-ice conduct, and this responsibility has and will continue to be exercised appropriately, fairly, and judiciously. I'll just briefly go through a couple of the relevant provisions which provide the league with that authority. In our collective bargaining agreement, the commissioner has broad authority to act and impose discipline when a player has been or is guilty of conduct that is detrimental to or against the welfare of the league or the game of hockey. This language has historically been applied by the league office to a wide array of personal conduct off-ice matters, and we believe it provides the league with an adequate degree of discretion and authority. The standard form employment contract, which is also part of our collective bargaining agreement, provides NHL teams with the authority to discipline players for conduct that violates the rule that requires a player to conduct himself on and off the rink according to the highest standards of honesty, morality, fair play, and sportsmanship, and to refrain from conduct detrimental to the best interest of the club, the league, and professional hockey generally. The National Hockey League remains committed to the principle of addressing players' personal conduct problems in a meaningful way, and by doing so, protecting and maintaining both the integrity and generally good reputation of our players and our sport. We do not hesitate to take disciplinary action in necessary and appropriate circumstances, as most recently evidenced by the indefinite suspension issued to a player in the NHL who was recently charged with a domestic violence offense. While no trial has occurred in that situation and the player remains innocent until proven guilty, we felt the most appropriate course of action in that case was to remove the player from the ice, at least until we are able to satisfy ourselves with respect to what has actually transpired. The NHL appreciates being provided with the opportunity to express our views here today, and we remain available to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Berman. Steve Fair, the Special Counsel, National Hockey League Players Association.
Thank you, and if I might, I would like to say I've never lived in and rarely been to West Virginia, but I've long been an admirer of a senator from West Virginia, and I would like to thank you for all that you've done, not just in holding this hearing, but throughout your career, and wish you the best in 2015 and beyond. In regard to none of the executive directors, other than Ms. Roberts, being able to show up, Senator Thune, I would like to say that the executive director of the NHLPA, who happens to have the same last name as I do, wanted very much to be at this hearing. He had a long-standing commitment overseas. I believe staff was told if the hearing was next week or yesterday or even this morning, he would have been able to attend. And he'd be happy to meet with you in your offices or at a future hearing. Could be some advantages and disadvantages to going last, like Ms. Barron's. I'm not going to read from my prepared statement. I appreciate that you place it in the record. It's a little too long, and parts of it would be a bit repetitive, not only what Ms. Berman said about the NHL, but what my colleagues, particularly Ms. Roberts and Ms. Seitz, said on behalf of the basketball players and the baseball players. But let me just make a few points. Professional athletes face extraordinary public scrutiny both on and off their field of play. They are often thrust into the public spotlight at a very young age, sometimes 20 or even younger in the NHL, with pressures few people ever experience during their lifetime. Many of you expect the players to be role models, but in most cases their background and training in high-performance athletics has done very little to assist them in assuming that role. In light of this, the NHLPA has worked diligently with the NHL to develop procedures, policies, and programs to help these young men and their families deal with these pressures. We believe our efforts have met with some success, but it is a never-ending project. It starts with education. We stress education for our players beginning at a young age. As Ms. Berman indicated, much of that is done through the SABH program, in which services are available to all players and to all who could be involved in a situation involving domestic violence. That includes families, that includes girlfriends, and I did ask staff if it was appropriate to say that word. Trained medical professionals are available for counseling and other services on a 24-hour basis. We also have our rookie orientation program. which has been in place for 2 years now. It was initiated by the Players Association along with the league. It is based on a model that was used in MLB, and as you may know, the executive director of the NHLPA worked as the executive director of the MLBPA for many years. We stress education and training of players coming into the league on many subjects, including domestic violence. On the subject of discipline, the CBA does give the commissioner power to discipline for what we call off-ice conduct. Obviously, that would include situations involving domestic violence. Under the CBA, such discipline is eventually reviewable to a neutral arbitrator. The arbitrator is asked to review, among other things, whether the discipline imposed by the commissioner for off-ice conduct was, quote, supported by substantial evidence and proportionate to the gravity of the offense. This right to appeal should encourage the fair and consistent application of disciplinary policies and of results that can withstand objective scrutiny. The fact that the arbitrator is independent, that is, not an employee of the NHL or a representative of the NHL, adds considerable credibility to the process and strengthens the perception that any penalties imposed are just. I should add, as I said in my statement, that discipline in this area can be complex, particularly when there is interplay between potential criminal charges or actual criminal charges and disciplinary proceedings on the workplace. Finally, as Commissioner Bettman said last week in a letter to the House Committee, there have been very few incidents that have come to light in recent years involving NHL players and domestic violence. And I do not say that, Senator Thune, to minimize or downplay the issue, because obviously it is a very important issue. And even if there is one, it is one too many, and we need to continue to work until there are none. Thank you for holding this hearing, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much. I just make an announcement. It's very, very difficult if the leadership holds votes at 4 o'clock for us to have a reasonable hearing. And so I'm trying with everything I can to get them to postpone those votes for at least a half an hour so that all members have a chance to speak and ask questions. It's much too important a hearing to let a couple of votes get in the way of it. Senator Thune.
Mr. Vincent, as we've discussed last Friday, the former federal judge who heard Ray Rice's appeal of his suspension ruled that Mr. Rice had not misled NFL Commissioner Roger Goodell about his confrontation with his fiancée. And in her 17-page opinion, the judge discusses the pre-discipline meeting between Ray Rice and Roger Goodell, stating that, and I quote, "At the time of the June 16th meeting, the NFL also knew that there was a camera inside the elevator and thought it was likely that there was a video from the camera. Various sources, including NFL security, had reported the existence of such a video. Rice had received this video in discovery during his criminal case, but the NFL never asked Rice for the second video." That's end quote. That's from the judge. So the question is, how did the commissioner not know that there was a second video inside the elevator at the time of the June 16th meeting with Mr. Rice?
Well, Senator, I'd like to begin with Judge Jones's decision in her opinion letter. And I thought it made it very clear the commissioner first imposing discipline and then coming back and imposing discipline again. That was a deficiency in our system. But as we read through her opinion letter, I think she made it obvious. If the commissioner had imposed more severe discipline on the onset, it would have made it very difficult for her to rule any differently. We've learned. I think the commissioner has acknowledged those mistakes. We have acknowledged those mistakes. This is all part of our evaluation as we look at the new personal conduct policy. We failed. The commissioner failed to impose the proper discipline in the Ray Rice case in the very beginning.
Okay, but the question is whether or not the second video, how did he not know that? I mean, I assume that it was there. Ray Rice had it.
Yes. Senator, the first video, heartless, gutless, despicable. I don't think there was a need for a second video to impose the proper discipline. We failed in that particular area. The commissioner has acknowledged that. Our office has acknowledged that. We made a critical mistake.
So what efforts is the NFL making to ensure that in the future that all the relevant available evidence is there before making a decision on whether and how to punish a player that's involved in a domestic violence or sexual assault case?
Well, I would begin, Senator, with stating having the right people at the table, having the right voices to evaluate, to potentially investigate these horrific crimes. I thought at the time, we know now that the right people weren't at the table. Listening to our experts across the country, we've learned that the right voices, the right discipline, the right process was not in place. We've learned from those mistakes. We've begun implementing, at least at minimum, having the right people, the right discussion, the right system, one, by protecting the victims first and survivors, and then secondly, working towards a fair process, but firm discipline.
When might we expect the Mueller investigation to conclude?
We're expecting that at any time. We've all been put on notice in our office as Mr. Mueller gives us a call or he wants to speak, to be cooperative. But we're hoping that ends, and we're expecting that report to come to some closure shortly.
Will that be a public report that will detail the results of that investigation?
I believe so.
I just want to ask a question, and this would be of the Players Association reps, and I'll try, in the interest of time, Mr. Chairman, to give other people an opportunity to ask questions, keep this very short. So if you could answer it in yes or no. But a lot of the focus has been on finding the right penalty for domestic violence. But would you agree that at its core, the solution will require athletes to take responsibility for their own conduct and use the same self-discipline that has allowed them to excel at sports to renounce and end this ugly violence? To the player responsibility. Ms. Patterson.
I would say that it's a multifaceted approach, which includes personal accountability, but I do believe it also includes education, counseling, and some of the other efforts that Ms. Roberts specifically spoke about, particularly before players come into the league. You know, we certainly acknowledge that accountability for your own actions is important and significant, but we do have to acknowledge that players, they are sons, they are brothers, they are fathers, husbands, and we just have to assist in that development.
Yes or no?
I would say accountability is a very critical part of any solution.
Ms. Roberts?
If I can turn the thing on, I would concur with both responses, yes.
I think players are and expect to be held accountable for their conduct in many ways.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I'm just going to ask one question, not a second question, just one question, so that everybody gets a chance to do so, and then we'll have a second round if we're so lucky. This is directed to Ms. Behrens and Ms. Roberts. The NBA's policy on domestic violence is a minimum 10-game suspension for felony violent acts. As I understand the policy, the league does not impose penalties when there is no conviction. That becomes important. But many domestic violence cases do not result in conviction because of some of the factors we've already discussed, the culture of silence and all of the rest of it. People withdraw, don't press, or whatever. Too often victims don't cooperate with law enforcement for a variety of reasons, so the charges are mysteriously dropped or defendants will plead no contest. When I hear no contest, red lights go off in all directions. But this has a very different effect. In the last 2 years, I'm aware of 6 NBA players who have been charged with domestic violence, but the league did not impose any penalties because there have been no convictions. So my question to Ms. Behrens, Ms. Roberts, are you prepared to develop uniform policies that will address conduct by players who have been charged with domestic violence, but there are no convictions?
Mr. Chairman, I think we, as I submitted to the committee, an opinion that the commissioner released about 2 weeks ago relating to the suspension of one of our players. And in that, the commissioner acknowledged that we needed to do more in this issue in terms of discipline going forward, both in terms of our due process and not really relying on the criminal justice system. One of the things that we've learned from our experts is that and a number of the members talked about it, certainly Senator McCaskill mentioned it, that domestic violence for too long has gone both underreported, under-prosecuted, and under-sentenced. And we are committed to making sure that we're not just relying on the criminal justice system going forward, and that we are independently investigating charges that might be brought against a player, and as such are making sure that the commissioner, who does have discretion beyond the 10 games that you mentioned in the collective bargaining agreement, does have discretion beyond that to impose a suspension that is longer, as we did in the recent case of Jeff Taylor. And so that is our plan going forward, that we will be doing independent investigations, ensuring due process for our players, and making sure that, that the suspensions are firm but fair.
Ms. Roberts?
What I would add, Senator, is that in the existing CBA, there is, in fact, language that allows the commissioner, even in the absence of a conviction, if there is a reasonable basis to conclude that a player has been engaged in violence, including domestic violence, counseling can be ordered, and again, as Kathy's mentioned, there is a basis to impose discipline. So it's quote-unquote in there. Having said that, I agree with Ms. Behrens. We are continuing to have discussions about ways to tweak and improve our system to the extent there's any absence of sufficient transparency about there being the ability to impose fair discipline.
So you're both indicate to me that you're moving away from the necessity for conviction before action can be taken.
What I am suggesting is that there is, as I said, there is language that does permit, if there is a reasonable basis to conclude that a player has engaged in violent conduct, including domestic violence, subject to an investigation by the commissioner. If that's substantiated, there is an ability to exact a punishment.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Senator Heller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, thanks for holding this hearing. Also to our witnesses that are here today, thank you for taking time. Ms. Patterson, most of my questions will be directed towards you. Yesterday, the Washington Post reported that the NFL and the Players Associations are still at odds regarding changes to the personal conduct policy and how players' discipline is handled. Is that accurate?
I would say yes.
It is accurate.
That's correct.
Also in the article, the union has taken the position that a player should have the right to determine whether they play or not after an incident like domestic violence or sexual assaults take place. Is that also accurate?
I wouldn't say that's accurate generally.
Can you be more specific?
Well, it's hard with the hypothetical. I don't.
I'm just taking the article. Is it true?
Right.
That the union's position is that a player should determine for themselves under certain incidents like domestic violence or sexual assault take place, determine for themselves whether or not they should play?
No, I would not say that's accurate.
What is accurate?
That we want to have confidence in a process in terms of discipline if an incident does occur, and we would like to collectively bargain with the league on how that discipline is applied.
So you're saying that the article in the Washington Post is inaccurate?
I'm saying the question that was posed, and it sounds narrowly such because I'm not familiar with the article and nor was I asked to be a part of it, but I'm saying that that part that you just asked me about is inaccurate.
I'm just trying to get to the point as to whether or not the Players Association is saying it's okay to knock out a woman with one punch on Wednesday and still suit up for a team on Sunday.
Absolutely not. We do not condone domestic violence. I stated that earlier, and I will keep stating it. What we do is defend players, and we defend the process.
Was a 12-game suspension appropriate for knocking out his fiancée with one punch in the Ray Rice case?
I don't know that that was appropriate. What we think is inappropriate is inconsistent and unfair handling of players and their issues.
What would it be inappropriate? I mean, you're eluding the questions. What would be an appropriate suspension for an individual that knocks out his wife?
Well, Senator, I apologize for appearing to elude the questions, but I just have to respectfully say that the union is not in the business of applying discipline. We're in the business of representing our membership to the full extent of their rights, both under the law and under the collective bargaining agreement.
I would tend to disagree, Ms. Patterson. You're either for stopping sexual assault, domestic abuse, and child abuse, or you're not.
Right, but I'm not suggesting that we're condoning any sort of misconduct.
Let me ask you this question then. Let me ask you this question. Do you believe sexual assault, domestic violence, and child abuse are far more important far more important than the union's issues with collective bargaining?
I would agree that they're far more important, but that's outside the scope of what we're talking about in terms of labor. I agree that societal issues are more important, yes.
Mr. Chairman, I have no more questions.
Yeah, you've done a very good job on the ones you've asked. Senator Klobuchar.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. I grew up with professional sports. I think I'm the only senator up here that has all 4 teams in these leagues in their state. I'm not competitive. But and my dad, as many of you may know, was a sports writer and then became a general columnist, and I literally would get tickets he would get an extra ticket to the NFL game, and I would go to watch him when I was 12 years old and stand outside the locker room and wait for him, and he would be the last one out, and there'd be some rather inebriated fans as we left, and he is only 5'6", but they would tap him on the back and say, "Great game." And he would always say, "It was a team effort." And I always have looked at sports that way, and I look at it from another way, and that as a prosecutor for 8 years, knowing what it's like when our office took on a very difficult case against the late Kirby Puckett, who was an icon in our state. We did not win that case, but I could understand that culture and how difficult it is to win those cases in the court of law. So I appreciate the questions that were asked about discipline beyond the courtroom. I also understand what it's like to take on domestic violence cases. Mr. Vincent, in our office, we had a poster outside of my door, and it was a woman with a Band-Aid on her nose, and she was holding a little boy, and the words under the poster said, "Beat your wife, and it's your kid that will go to jail." And I so appreciated your personal story and your willingness to stop that cycle of violence in your own life, and I know how difficult that is, so thank you very much. My question is really about how to make sure that these criminal cases move forward. I was disturbed by reports in the New York Times and the Washington Post that leagues or teams may be discouraging women that come forward to them, wives or partners of players, from going forward to law enforcement. The only way you stop this cycle is not only what I hope you are all doing now with your new approach to these issues, as having tough penalties, but I also think you have to make sure that people are not discouraged from going forward. So I would just like to ask this question of the 4 league representatives that are here, and that is that do your teams ever discourage people that come to them, the owners or the coaches, from going forward with domestic violence cases to law enforcement? And do you have a policy in place, and can you control these owners or coaches from doing that to make sure going forward that this does not happen again? I would start with you, Mr. Vincent.
Well, Senator, we hope that that doesn't occur. And that is the culture that we have to break. That's the cycle that we have to break as we look at implementing our new policy. We've been talking about personal accountability. We've also been talking extensively about club accountability. We want to make sure that the victims and survivors actually have the proper support, that these women, these children, that we can break that silence, that they have a place that they can go to, they have support confidentially, that they're safe when they go homes. We've embedded ourselves with our critical response teams and making sure the local support is in place. But for misbehavior...
Just this one, I have a very focused question about not stopping people from going forward to law enforcement, not discouraging them from discouraging them. Is there a way to control the coaches and the team owners by saying you cannot do that? If someone comes forward, you have to encourage them to go to law enforcement.
Yes, ma'am. And part of our education, that's something that we're educating on.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Mr. Torrey.
Yes, Senator. I wholeheartedly agree with you on not discouraging the victims from coming forward, because that would be the worst thing that could happen. And I hope it doesn't happen in our sport, because I know winning games are very important, but to me, being a good human being certainly surpasses that.
And is there a policy in place?
Well, we are discussing with the Players Association.
But why would the Players Association influence whether or not you tell someone to not go forward to law enforcement?
No, I misunderstood that. There's no question.
That's a negotiable issue.
Our teams are, and we have general managers meetings, we have owners meetings, and I speak to every manager, and it's about doing things the right way.
Okay.
And certainly being a human being is much more important. I went overboard, but that's why
I appreciate that. I just think you've got to think of this different than the collective bargaining issue. This is about going forward with a criminal investigation. Ms. Behrens?
Senator, yes. We in fact are, as part of our education efforts, doing enhanced training for our team staff. And one of the things that we're making very clear is not only are we saying not to discourage, but we're encouraging and making sure that teams are being proactive in this space. And our first line is support victims first. And we're making that clear.
Ms. Berman?
I'm unaware of any discouragement, and to the contrary, we have a system in place where the NHL centralized security department has contacts at every local team where if something like that was going on, I would hope we would be hearing about it because it certainly would violate league policy.
Thank you.
Are you finished?
Yeah.
Okay. Senator Schatz.
No?
I just an order of appearance.
Chair.
It is Senator McCaskill.
Chair, I defer to Senator McCaskill.
I think I beat you in the room. First, let me correct the record on the NBA questions about punishment. I've looked at the articles and the sections on counseling for violent misconduct. Let me make sure the record is clear. The most a commissioner can do for violence without a conviction is counseling. Isn't that correct, Ms. Behrens?
No, Senator, I'm sorry, that's not correct.
So what can the commissioner do besides counseling if there's not a conviction?
The commissioner has discretion under our collective bargaining agreement, which is the discretion that he used in the suspension of Jeff Taylor most recently. And that discretion and that the language refers to the notion that conduct that is detrimental to the league, is not necessarily related to a violation or a conviction.
Thank you. I also handled domestic violence cases for many years, started the first domestic violence unit in Kansas City, and when I began that unit in the 90s, the detectives told me, well, you know, we really can't do these cases because victims won't come forward. Victims refuse to testify, so why are you doing this? Why are you making us go through the motions of trying to prosecute domestic violence? And I said, well, we better shut down the homicide unit. And they looked at me blankly, and I said, well, we don't have victims in homicide cases. But we managed to put a case together based on an investigation as to what occurred, based on witnesses' testimony who witnessed the event, based on physical evidence, based on 911 calls. And I point this out because I think one of the biggest problems you all have writ large is this notion that you all can sit back and wait to see if there is in fact a criminal prosecution and conviction. And I think you all know fundamentally the pressure that is brought to bear on that victim from the moment an arrest is made or from the moment the team finds out. Because many times, you all know, you have a lot of off-duty police officers that are huge fans, and they work for you all. And when they find out one of your guys are in trouble, I know this for a fact, because when I was the prosecutor, I got the call that Chris Carter was involved in something in Westport, a big, famous Chief player, and I immediately heard from the team about what I should and shouldn't do with Chris Carter. Before I'd even heard from the police department, I heard from the team. So what we really have to do here is look to see what you are doing independently to investigate these cases and independently determine what the facts are. Because that's how the NFL got in trouble, Mr. Vincent, is you didn't see it, Roger Goodell didn't see it as his responsibility to ask the question, is there another tape and I need to see it before we do punishment? There was not a process in place. And let me just give you one example. And I think we should say for the record that Major League Baseball Commissioner Bud Selig has never sanctioned an MLB player for domestic violence. Never. In 22 years. Now, teams have, but at the commissioner level, that has never occurred. And I'm going to go through one example. Francisco Rodriguez. And this is based on, by the way, I found all this just Googling around on my iPad last night preparing for this hearing. This wasn't prepared by my staff. Anybody could do this that just looked into Rodriguez's record that is written in print. In 2005, based on sworn court testimony, he put a young lady by the name of Diane Pena. He hit her so hard that she was hospitalized in Venezuela. He then convinced her to move to the United States with him, and in 2010, he assaulted her father at the Mets stadium, pulling him out of the family lounge. At the time, Carlos Beltran said, well, this is bad. We all have problems at home, but you need to keep it at home. He was prosecuted for that, and during the prosecution of that, he had order of protection entered to not contact the young lady or her father. He violated those orders of protection. This is in 2010. Violated those orders of protection, was convicted of the assault of her father, and given 1 year anger management. He then goes on to the Milwaukee Brewers, and in 2012, he's arrested, a 911 call at 2:40 in the morning, and his girlfriend is huddled in a closet at their home and tells everyone what has occurred. Excuse me, that's my phone. Tells everyone what has occurred. They arrest him. There's staff there at the home who's also from Venezuela. So what happens? The case is not prosecuted because guess where the victim and the housekeeper went? To Venezuela. He then becomes a free agent, and guess where he is back in 2014? He's back at Milwaukee, pitching and pitches in the All-Star game. And nothing has ever happened to him in terms of baseball. Now, I know I've taken all my time, but I wanted to get that story out there. And what I would like for the record, and I'm going to stick around for another round if the chairman is willing to do it, because I want to know from each of you, how serious is your league about an independent investigation into the facts? Or how content are you to sit back and go, well, maybe she won't go through with it. Maybe she won't come forward. And if there's not a conviction, we're off the hook. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator McCaskill. Senator Schatz. No, the vote start, you think at 4:10? Senator Schatz.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member. My question is for Mr. Vincent. We know Commissioner Goodell recently changed the NFL's domestic violence policy to require a 6-game suspension for first offenses. We also know that after he changed that policy, Mr. Goodell personally called Ray Rice. What was the content of that conversation?
I wasn't aware of him calling Mr. Rice.
Well, this has been widely reported, and my understanding is that it was to reassure him that this would be applied prospectively rather than retroactively. And you're not aware of this?
No, sir. Okay.
Well, I'd like to offer you these questions, and you can get back to the committee, because my question for you about that is this normal? Does the league consider this appropriate? Does the commissioner, as a general proposition, interact directly with players who are subject to disciplinary proceedings, or was this a one-off? And I think it goes to the culture that Senator Heller spoke of in his opening statement, which is get the player back on the field. Your financial incentives are aligned towards getting the player back on the field. And I found it odd, and I found nothing in your policies and procedures that would indicate that it was appropriate for the commissioner of the Football League to call an individual player to reassure him that everything was just fine.
Senator, I will investigate that and get any information back to you.
Thank you. The NFL's handling of domestic violence is illogical, in my opinion, especially when you look at the strict treatment of athletes who violate the drug policy. Take Josh Gordon. Mr. Gordon was suspended for an entire season for testing positive for marijuana during the offseason. This imbalanced treatment actually happens all the time, ESPN analyzed cases and found of players found guilty of domestic violence between 2000 and 2014. The analysis showed that in 88% of the cases, the NFL suspended players for only one game or not at all for domestic violence, while in comparison, in 82% of substance abuse cases, the NFL handed out suspensions of 4 games or more. Does the league consider that to be an inconsistency that has to be corrected going forward?
Yes, sir, Senator. And that's one of the things that we've been looking at, that we've been evaluating. I think now our staffers, the commissioner, when you learn the complexities and the severity of child abuse, domestic violence, and sexual assault, we failed. We failed in that area to punish, to hold one accountable. I know recently in the Players Association most recent proposal, and this is one of the complexities that we have. When is it the appropriate time to take someone off the field? The most recent proposal said you need a conviction. We strongly disagree with that. We strongly disagree that there needs to be a felony or a conviction for us to remove someone off the field.
Where are the owners in all of this? I know we've sort of touched upon this issue, but it seems to me, in particular with the NFL, a lot of the leverage is with the individual teams, and a lot of the difficulty is within the individual teams, and the teams aren't represented, if I'm not mistaken, at this table. And I'm wondering what leverage you think the NFL can exercise with respect to its interactions with the owners, because certainly in the Ray Rice case, the problem was system-wide, but it was in particular with the Baltimore Ravens as an organization. And I'm wondering how those interactions are going. I think Senator Heller and others are referring to the collective bargaining process. That's part of it. But really, a lot of the challenges that the financial incentives of the owners are to get the player back on the field and figure that the fans will forgive them in the end.
Yes, and in our last 2 owners meetings, we have one coming in the next 2 weeks. It's been the focus of our discussion, some uniformity to make sure that we are consistent with penalty process and how we see.
So what leverage are you prepared to exercise in your interactions with the owners? Because I understand that by revenue, the owners are bigger than the league, and I'm wondering what you're prepared to do to try to get the owners to participate in this new system of accountability.
Well, we're looking at all options, and one of the things when we start talking about club accountability, maybe the removal of draft picks. You know, you have to do things to really hit the club, to hold the clubs accountable, but all things are on the table. We're discussing all options to make sure that everyone's held accountable, the player, the staff, local law enforcement that's working with the team, as well as the clubs themselves.
Thank you very much.
I'm going to go vote. Is that a quorum call? Is that I can't see that. It has not been called yet. Okay, who's next, Maria? Senator Walsh. Followed by you.
This question is for you. As you mentioned, you and your wife founded the Safe at Home Foundation to educate young people about domestic violence. Proactive approaches to ending the cycle of domestic violence, like your foundation, are critical, so thank you and your wife for taking that on. Can you tell us about your experience with the foundation and what education strategies you have found to be most effective in preventing domestic violence before it starts, and what could be incorporated from your foundation into the leagues?
Well, I just feel our Safe at Home Foundation, when we first started the foundation, we were deciding on which way to approach, because growing up in that environment, I really didn't find out until later on in life that a lot of my insecurities came from what was going on in my home, where my dad was abusing my mom. And having been a child growing up that way, I was lucky. I got to play baseball, so I had a place to hide. Not a lot of youngsters are that lucky. So when we first started, I went to a middle school and started talking to youngsters, not about baseball. I said, we'll talk about baseball in a minute, but I want to explain this camera crew behind me, because we were going to have our first gala. And in speaking to the youngsters about what was going on in my home, I looked out there, and about 6 or 7 of them are shaking their head like this. In other words, we struck a nerve. So the most important thing, we have a master's level counselor in each one of our rooms. We named them after my mom, Margaret's place. And what we do is let the kids know that, first of all, it's not their fault, and they're not the only ones going through this. When I grew up, I thought I was the only one. I was embarrassed to share it with anybody. And we've had a number of, as I said earlier, close to 50,000 youngsters that have come through our programs. We have peer leadership programs. We just don't reach enough kids. That's our issue for me. Because, you know, I don't believe they're bad kids. I think kids do bad things. And you know, just from my experience with the Attorney General's Defending Childhood Task Force, going around and listening to so many different, you know, gang members, tribal communities, you realize how many different layers of domestic violence or violence, period, that there are. And what we try to do with these youngsters that come through our program is to make them think that their future, make them understand their future is out there. It's not like when they leave school and they're sort of helpless, just go with the first strong personality they see. We educate them to the point of making them feel pretty good about themselves.
Thank you, Senator Walsh. Senator Ayat.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Excuse me.
You know, one thing I wanted to note up front is that all of you are here. We're appreciative that you're here testifying today. But Commissioner Goodell, Commissioner Seelig, Commissioner Silver, Commissioner Bettman, they were all asked to be here. And leadership does start at the top. And I do think that it's pretty convenient that none of them were able to appear today. And it does say something about where does the level of commitment come? Because I think they should all be here today. And while I'm appreciative that you've been willing to appear in their stead, I think that does say something about how big a commitment is there going to be on this. And that does need to lead to the owners as well, who have to take responsibility for what happens here. I want to associate myself with the comments of Senator McCaskill because you do need to establish an investigative process for these cases that do not result in criminal conviction. And this is imperative because you have to hold yourselves to a higher standard. And the bottom line is that in many of these cases, victims are not going to come forward because of the financial pressure that they face, the social pressure that they face, and the terror that they face. But that does not alleviate your responsibility to get the facts, to look at the evidence, and to still impose discipline even if a victim is too terrified to come forward. In the same regard, I wanted to follow up on Senator Klobuchar's questions about the reports of victims who are being encouraged or perhaps discouraged not to come forward, or in the instance that Senator McCaskill gave where one was actually flown to another country. I believe that as you look at your policies, the sanctions should be as severe for this type of witness tampering as it should be for the underlying violent acts. Because that's what this is, witness tampering. And that, if you put those sanctions in place, will make very clear that if someone is a victim of domestic or sexual violence, that neither the coaches nor the players nor anyone else should be interfering with their ability to come forward or interfering with the way that they are able to be safe or the support that they need as victims of a crime. Now, I wanted to ask specifically a follow-up question on an issue as I look to you, Ms. Roberts, and to Ms. Patterson. One of the things that I'm concerned about as I've listened to the testimony today is that in terms of the players' side of this, that they not hide behind the collective bargaining process or agreement when it comes to basic accountability and basic responsibility for not committing crimes, because this is what they are, crimes. Crimes of violence against women, sexual violence against women, or as we've seen some instances, violence against children. And so as I look at, I want to use an example, Ms. Roberts, the recent situation of the imposition of discipline against Jeff Taylor who's a Charlotte Hornet player, and I understand he received 24-game suspension for a conviction for domestic violence for beating a girlfriend. And what I saw was the unions complained that that suspension was excessive. As I understand it, the player himself has accepted this suspension. And I have to say your response, or the union's response, I don't know if it was yours in particular, to say that this was excessive, to me highlights the problem that we're facing. And it's disgusting to me that you would say that that's excessive. So I want you to address that.
Sure, I'm happy to.
What do we do in those situations? Why do you believe that was excessive? And if we're going to get at this issue, this has to be the players and the responsibility of the officials in the league and the owners, and everyone has to have a hand at this. So I'd like to know what you were thinking, or not you particularly, but the unions.
I'm happy to answer your question, Senator. And let me be clear. The Players Association was not for 1 second suggesting that some punishment was not warranted. Of course it was warranted, and we expected the commissioner to impose punishment, and he did. Our position was simply that we have a CBA, which we believed, and we have a disagreement about this, had precedent that indicated that that was an excessive punishment. The commissioner, when he imposed the punishment, acknowledged that it was a significant departure from prior punishments. And so again, our position was that the CBA required us to collectively bargain if there was going to be some imposition of punishment that belied the CBA. Having said that, the player was never discouraged from accepting responsibility. It was his desire, his right to grieve or not to grieve. He chose not to grieve, and I said to him in his face, and I said it behind his back, and I'll say it again, we absolutely endorse his decision to take responsibility for what he did, and the matter has been closed. My only point, Senator, is this. While we all agree, and we do all agree that this is very serious business and we need to take it seriously, we don't believe that we need to, at the same time, abandon due process. And that's the only point. That doesn't mean that 24 games may not be appropriate under certain circumstances. It simply meant that within the four corners of the CBA, and again, we have a disagreement about this, it did go beyond the scope of what was collectively bargained for. But I don't want you, Senator, or anyone to assume that the National Basketball Players Association does not take this seriously. We do. I have spent the last 2 weeks visiting with 9 of my 30 teams. I intend to see the rest of them in the next 2 months. And every time I meet with them, I make clear to them that we will not tolerate this kind of conduct. It's not the NFL problem, it's our problem as well. And so I don't want our position on the Jeff Taylor matter to in any way confuse our commitment to making sure that this thing goes away. And my only final point I'd make is this.
No, I'm sorry, your time is over.
Then I guess I won't.
Senator Blumenthal is next. I'm going to go vote. Senator Cantwell will be chair, and I'll be back. And let's just work it out, okay? But we got to keep it going.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for having this hearing. I want to join in expressing my admiration for your proceeding in spite of the obstacles, some of them that have been raised, and thank all of you for being here. We have some sports heroes here, and we have some professional legal heroes, and I'm grateful to each of you for coming to talk to us today. But I want to talk about the people who are not here, the owners, and in a certain sense, they are the bosses. They're going to be the ones who make the ultimate decision. Let's just talk the realities here. And the financial reality is that words and promises are a lot more difficult than action. And I'm looking for a way to impose accountability beyond a hearing, beyond negotiations, and accountability that means something in dollars and cents. Right now, the professional leagues represented here are not only the object of public scrutiny, they are the beneficiary of huge benefits in the form of tax breaks, subsidies for teams and stadiums, as well as, chief among them, the antitrust exemption. Today, I am proposing that we end the blank check to the leagues, the antitrust exemption that has enabled the leagues to successfully negotiate together, as no other corporations in the United States would be permitted to do under antitrust law, for literally billions of dollars. And that antitrust exemption should be contingent on doing the right thing, really acting, not only talking about acting, but doing it. And by acting, I mean investigating comprehensively and aggressively, imposing sanctions as a consequence of that investigation, adopting a due process that has been so sorely lacking, and Mr. Vincent is the reason why the league was so embarrassed, because there was no process, as Ms. Patterson has also observed. And maybe most important, looking forward, and really it hasn't been mentioned here, aid to the organizations and groups that provide assistance to the survivors and victims of domestic violence within your leagues, in your families, and across the United States. I want to thank Mr. Torrey for his example, because I think men have a vital role, which is the reason why your players can be such role models, such positive role models for others, and why the leagues can be such positive role models in providing tangible financial assistance, which you have not yet done, for all the talk here, to the advocacy groups and organizations that are so pivotal in fighting domestic violence. So I'm asking for a commitment that you will support this accountability and that you will support the groups that assist victims and survivors. In the interest of time, I'm just going to ask, is there anyone here who would not make that commitment? By the absence of a response, I'm going to assume that you would agree with me that that kind of commitment is important and necessary. You've begun doing it, but I'm not asking you to continue what you've done, but for a substantial increase in that assistance to the hotlines and the shelters and all the service groups, and I hope that you will all join in that commitment. Let me ask Mr. Vincent, what is the timeline for you, for the league, to adopt a process for imposing punishment within the NFL?
The commissioner had stated in his earlier press conference that he would like to have a new policy in place by the Super Bowl. Will be the latest.
And what is the process that will provide for owners to approve that process?
And next week, we actually have our owners meeting where we'll begin to talk about, again, some of the things that we've learned. We've heard much about the process, accountability. So we're hoping to have within the next 2 weeks a real clarity in the position on where we are as far as a real formal, firm process, a consistent and clear process moving forward.
The bill that I proposed would sunset the professional sports leagues antitrust exemptions under the 1961 Sports Broadcasting Act and the comparable provisions for the MLB 1 year after the bill's enactment. It would authorize a commission to provide a report to Congress regarding the league's behavior in the interests of the public, and it would allow Congress to reauthorize exemptions every 5 years based in part on commitments to aid public service organizations. How much is the NFL willing to commit to aid those organizations?
Well, we've made substantial commitments. We've made 5 years commitments to both the National Domestic Violence Hotline.
And what is the amount of those commitments?
I think it's almost $4 to $5 million a year.
You've made a commitment to the National
Domestic Hotline.
$4 to $5 million a year?
Yes, sir.
Would you willing to make commitments of the same or comparable size to other organizations that do similar kinds of work?
I cannot make that commitment today.
Senator
Who can
Booker,
make that commitment?
I just want to make sure we're trying to get the rest of the members in, so your time has expired.
Who can make that commitment?
That's something that we discuss as an entire team. We discuss with our experts who are those leading organizations, those organizations at the grassroots level that need the support to support our families, to support NFL personnel. So that's a collective decision that was made for us to support the National Domestic Violence Hotline and the National Sexual Assault Resource Center.
Thank you very much to all of you. I'm sorry that my time has expired.
Thank you. Senator Booker.
Thank you. Real quick, I just want to thank the ranking member for saying that perhaps we should be revisiting this after the new year, when I assume you'll be the chairperson, because that issue of accountability keeps coming up. Only can be held by this body should we have the chance to revisit this and see the progress that's been made. I'm going to go very quickly as a vote has been called. You obviously, Mr. Vincent, are saying that you're seeking to help fund, and a lot of the charity you enumerated in your opening statement was about funding and supporting domestic violence prevention, domestic violence treatment, and the like. And that's true that you see that those organizations often need more resources. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Torrey, real quick. The Major League Baseball does not have a tax-exempt status. Is that correct? The actual league, Major League Baseball.
Right. Correct.
Does that hurt your financial bottom line?
No, I don't think so.
Right. And so, not I don't think so either.
Yeah, I think we're doing well. Yeah.
Mr. Vincent, the Congressional Budget Office says if we remove those teams, those leagues, unlike Major League Baseball, there's a number of leagues, including the NFL, that have a tax-exempt status. The Congressional Budget Office says if we remove that tax-exempt status, it would yield millions of dollars a year annually back to taxpayers. And so my question is to you is, understanding that these organizations need more funding, why does the NFL need a tax-exempt status when we could be redirecting the money to domestic violence prevention and treatment programs?
Well, what I would say, let me make it clear, all club revenues, all league-generated revenue.
You don't have to enumerate that for the record. I am very familiar with individual teams' revenues. I'm simply asking you, right now, I have to justify to my constituents why the NFL, this multi-billion-dollar organization, has tax-exempt status. Do you believe that that just like the Major League Baseball, do you believe that you should have tax-exempt status?
Yes, we're ran just like a trade association, very similar.
No.
Our office.
So you think that you should continue to enjoy a tax-exempt status that Major League Baseball does not have?
No, it's not to enjoy. Today, that's how we're currently ran. Our clubs, again, all revenues tax. And Senator, I've actually saw your proposal, and I do believe that when we combine both public and private resources, we could fund the intervention and the prevention. Some of the things that I've seen in your proposal. This is how we, both collectively, both privately and public resources, we can make a difference in the area of domestic violence, sexual assault, and child abuse.
And I really appreciate that, and I appreciate the charity. My simple point is, our professional leagues that enjoy, as the senator just said, exemptions to a lot of laws and enjoy a tax-exempt status simply should not enjoy a tax-exempt status, where that money that the Congressional Budget Office says could save taxpayers millions of dollars annually. That money could be used to invest in these programs that right now it seems we have to rely on the charity of the NFL, and I don't think that's adequate. But let me shift gears real quick. I feel very, very fortunate, having played college football, to have a lot of friends that have played in the NFL, played in the NBA, and some friends that are still in the NFL and NBA. And I've been described to me as this incredible resources. Player orientation to me is dazzling when they let the players know, hey, we're here for you. If there's a crisis, you have hotlines. If you're stuck at a club and can't get a ride and are inebriated, the NFL is there for you, right? You can call. And the NBA, this I know. Thank you for shaking your head. Maybe you're not aware.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. And so one of the concerns I have is that when it comes to calling that team for issues of domestic violence, that often the incentive, from my experience and what I know about my friends that are players, forgive me, I only know the NBA and NFL players, is that often the objective is to keep that player out of the news, to keep issues quiet, and to me that works against ultimately what the goal is of when it comes to domestic violence, which is bringing light and attention to a problem, as opposed to just creating an environment where it's swept under the rug. And so one of the big concerns I have as these reforms are discussed and talked about is this rapid response that that clearly we see, that I know about personally, that rapid response doesn't have two different objectives that are contrary to actually dealing with the problem that might be encountered. And I'd just like, in the second that I have left, if you could give me some assurances that what I know to be the case from friends who've played and are playing in the NFL and NBA, that this system will be changed in a way that puts the victims' needs and concerns and family situations ahead of that player's ability to remain on the field and the corporate interest that exists to keep that player being productive.
Yes.
And I'd like both NBA representatives and NFL representatives to do so, and I'm done.
Great. Well, that is at the core of what we're talking about, what we've been evaluating, is to make sure that the victims and the survivors have the support that they need. We recognize that we have to break the culture of silence. The programs that you mentioned, the last 4 years, that was my sole responsibility, player programs and services. It's a shared responsibility. Those programs are put in place in collaboration with the Players Association to assist families. We want to encourage the families to seek out proper help, proper assistance. I can assure you, moving forward in the area of domestic violence, sexual assault, and child abuse, that we want to make sure that we break that silence, that the victims and survivors are safe.
And Senator, I'll just make the same assurance that part of our training and education program that we're rolling out with our teams and have shared at the highest levels is to make sure that this is not something that is discouraged, but encouraged, both for people to get help, but also to report behavior that's in violation of certainly of any criminal law and any violation of the NBA's codes of conduct.
And just a return to the chair, that's the accountability that we need to make sure these systems are changing. And just for the record, I think it's ridiculous that the NFL and other sports teams enjoys tax-exempt status. That's resources the taxpayers could be using.
Thank you, Senator Booker. And so actually, thank you for emphasizing that point, because I don't think I'm going to have time for questions, and I will just submit some questions for the record. But that particular issue is of interest to me, and obviously the fact that the Baseball Association and Basketball Association don't enjoy that tax-exempt status, and yet the NFL continues it. I guess my main point is we saw this case with Donald Sterling, and we saw immediate and swift action. In fact, Michael Jordan praised the NBA, saying a powerful message was sent that there can be no tolerance, zero tolerance for racism and hatred. So it's clear that in some cases, these organizations can act swiftly and do act swiftly. The question is, in this issue of domestic violence, why you don't. And I think that what we're hearing from many of my colleagues today is what is the culture within these organizations that prevent it from acting as swiftly as was in the case of Donald Sterling. So I'm going to submit some questions for the record. But I also, too, want to be on record that the NFL, I'm hearing from my constituents as I've raised this issue related to what is a very hateful name in association with the NFL, but my constituents now are just flabbergasted that the NFL continues to enjoy a tax-exempt status. For what purpose? And yet, on these issues of having a name of hatred for a team and then having these cases of domestic violence, to say nothing of the incidents of what happened in Florida with players, the NFL is not showing the leadership that I believe that it should, and it certainly doesn't deserve the tax-exempt status. So I'm going to submit some further questions for the record, and I want to thank my colleague, Senator McCaskill, for her leadership on this issue, and certainly want to work with her in her role as previously understanding these issues from a prosecutorial perspective of how we can get some cultural issues ingrained into these institutions. So I'm going to turn the gavel over to you, and thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to state on the record here that I'm going to miss a vote. I think this is, I would vote aye on the nominee that we're voting on right now, and the record should reflect that. But I'm going to skip that vote because I think the questions that need to be asked here in the long run could have more impact on a problem that I think is pervasive and important than one more vote in a confirmation that is going to occur with or without my vote. So I'm going to stick around. So Mr. Rubio, you have an opportunity to question now, and then hopefully I'll get another chance.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate it. Thank you all for being here. And I'm going to limit my comments to the National Football League, although all of you, domestic violence is important in society as a whole in all of the sports. It's the sport I'm most familiar with, as both a fan of it, living in a city that has a franchise. You may not know this, but had it not, I would have played in the NFL had it not been for my lack of size, speed, and talent. So, but that was my goal. And I want to begin by saying, Mr. Vincent, you're I have the highest respect for you, though. You and I have never met. We have a lot of friends in common. Your reputation among many in league circles is as high as anyone I've ever heard, certainly. As a Dolphin fan, I remember us drafting you in 1992, and sorry to see you leave in 1995 when Jimmy let you go. It was a big mistake, in 96. But in any event, I appreciate your service at both as a player for the NFLPA, I believe, and now for the league. But I do want to make 2 points about the NFL that are important and ask you this question. The NFL doesn't just play for 3 hours on Sundays, Monday and Thursday nights. The NFL is a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week endeavor that actively wants Americans to admire and emulate the people it puts on the field. It wants our young people to wear, and this is true of all the leagues, but I want to, again, I'm focused on the NFL. It wants young people like my sons, and they want to and do, to wear the same shoes, to wear their jerseys, to buy the same and use the same products. I mean, we just read a couple weeks ago, now they regulate what earphones they can use during pregame warmups because the league has established a contract with one of the providers, and they want them to wear those. So this is an ongoing 24-hour endeavor. It wants young people to emulate and to look up to these athletes, and they do. In fact, I can tell you, being involved now in youth football, and this is very sad, but it is true in some instances, some of the only positive male role models that many young Americans today have happen to be the professional athletes they'd see on Sundays or at nights on television in any of your leagues. So I think it's important to preface that, because this is not just a sport that's played on a field 3 hours at a time. This actually has deep impacts throughout society. And there are millions of young, especially young boys, but young Americans, who look up to these players, and whatever happens or does not happen with them has a deep impact on them, because for many of them, it's the only male role model that they have in their lives, unfortunately, in the cases where people go wrong. And that's why the Ray Rice case so interested me, because the situation with Mr. Rice involved, number one, someone that my sons actually personally admired. My sons actually came to admire Ray Rice because there's, now getting deep in the weeds here, but one of my sons kind of plays a hybrid running back position. He's not the tallest kid on the team, but he's very quick. And so he looked for someone on the National Football League that had the same attributes, and that was Ray Rice. And he really looked up to him. And a few weeks ago, he wanted to know, why isn't Ray Rice playing? And I had to explain to him why he wasn't playing. And the impact of that was extraordinary on him. He's still kind of young to fully comprehend what it means. But what happened or didn't happen with him had an impact on him and other young people across America, because it served as an example of what happens in society and in life when someone does the wrong thing. So that's why I'm so interested in that case, beyond the horrifying instance that happened. My understanding from the testimony I watched on television a few minutes ago is that you stated that the commissioner nor the league had ever seen the elevator video, but that it didn't need to, because in essence, everything that happened in that elevator that the video showed had already been admitted to and testified to by Mr. Rice. Is that correct?
Yes. And if I can, Senator, again, the commissioner had stated that he had not yet seen the video, and as I mentioned earlier, I think any one of us who had witnessed that, saw that despicable act.
But the point is that Mr. Rice, whatever we saw on the video, and it's certainly a horrifying video to watch, but he basically had already told the commissioner that whatever that video showed, he had already admitted to. Is that correct?
Yes.
And so basically, not having seen the video is the same as having seen it in this instance. That's what you've said here today, that you didn't need to see the video because they already knew what happened.
Senator, as I acknowledged in the beginning, we made a mistake.
I guess I'm trying to understand the process by which, and you may have explained this already, what is the process? Because I know what would have happened to Ray Rice had he tested positive for marijuana. I know what would have happened to Ray Rice had he tested positive for steroids or an amphetamine or epinephrine, had he taken Sudafed at the wrong time without a doctor's note. I know what would have happened to him if he would have done any of those things. Is this a completely arbitrary process where the commissioner assigns punishment based on how he feels, or is there a set model in place for what what an action equals, an admitted action, because this is not an instance that there was a dispute. Mr. Rice fully admitted that what he did and actually described it to an extent that you said here today you didn't need to see the video to know how bad it was. What is the criteria that they use to determine the punishment?
Senator, we failed to impose the proper discipline.
But I guess my question is, how do we measure? I wanted to know, how is it that what is the process in place moving forward, I suppose, as well? But at the time, what was the process if someone came forward, admitted what we saw in the video, that they had punched their fiancé in the face in an elevator? By what measure did the commissioner decide how to impose a punishment? Why 3 games instead of 10? Why 6 games instead of a full year? Was it fully just arbitrary, or was there something he looked to as a measuring stick?
No, I would say actually look back to some of the past cases, and then when he's actually tried to impose discipline, harsher discipline in the past, it was appealed and knocked down. And I think that shows the severity of what we know about these crimes. He went back and typically
appealed to an arbitrator.
The Players Association appealed that offense, and the discipline that was handed out in the past was appealed and knocked down.
So your testimony is that if a player comes forward and says to the league, "I just punched my fiancée in the face and knocked her out," and the commissioner decides, "I'm going to suspend you for a year," the players' union will file an appeal against that decision because 1 year is too long for someone that just punched their fiancée in the face and admitted to it.
The Players Association has that ability.
And they've been successful.
That's one of that's where we have our challenges.
What is the criteria now?
That's what we're developing. The commissioner right now has the ability to either impose or designate an individual to see the case, to hear the case. Right now, understanding and learning the complexities that are associated with it. It's been talked earlier about having internal investigations or parallel investigations with law enforcement, but we're looking at, again, severe discipline. Our August 28th letter to both the owners and also the players, the commissioner spelled out very clearly, first offense, a minimum of 6 games. Aggravating factors gives him or his designee the ability to impose more severe punishment.
My time is up.
Thank you. Thank you very much. First, I wanted to comment before I didn't get a chance. I've never seen so many women representing Major League sports, professional sports in this country at a moment of high-profile importance for the leagues, and I think it's a good thing. I think it's terrific, and I would tell all of you to go back to the organizations you represent and say that you need to be at the table more often, not less often. But I don't think I ever recall seeing this many women representing professional sports at a moment like this in our country's history, so I wanted to make note of that. First, I had a question to the National Hockey League. In reading about the suspension of the player that occurred recently, I think he's a defenseman for the Kings, yes, and I won't try to pronounce his name. I noticed in the article that the team was complaining because his salary was going to continue to count against the salary cap while he was punished. I found that interesting because it creates a financial incentive for the team to not punish. So my question to you, yes or no, does the league favor removing a salary counting against the salary cap during a time of suspension?
Initially, when suspension was imposed, it was determined by the league office that the suspension should be with pay. So while the team continues to pay the player, that money counts against the team's salary cap. Subsequently, we reached an agreement with the union to change the treatment for the team's perspective with a host of conditions so that it's no longer counting against the cap.
So are you saying, and is this true with all of you that have caps, that when someone is suspended for misconduct with pay, that pay counts against the salary cap, so the team is in fact being financially punished for doing the right thing?
Well, this wasn't discipline that was imposed by the team. With all due respect, it was imposed by the league. So the team doesn't have an incentive one way or the other to act or not act because we handle.
But the team could impose it. And wouldn't it still count against their salary cap?
Only if they were choosing to pay the player during the discipline.
Okay. Well, is that true with the other leagues? If someone is suspended with pay, does that count against salary caps?
Yes, well, we just had our last two when we look at the Adrian Peterson and the Greg Hardy. When they were put on the commissioner's exempt list, the team was penalized. There's a salary cap. Why they weren't, it's an example of pay leave. So the team is actually being punished because that is a cap hit.
Okay. Well, I think you all ought to look at that. I think you need to remove every disincentive there is to punish players who have had bad conduct. And, you know, if a team's going to have the money count against the salary cap, even when the player's not playing, then that's going to weigh in favor of a much shorter suspension for the team-imposed discipline. So I'll follow up with QFRs on that. Do any of you have a process in place now to independently investigate the facts?
Yes, Senator, I'll answer that question. I think as we talked about with our recent case involving the player Jeffrey Taylor, we immediately commenced an independent investigation, retained 2 outside counsel, including 2 former prosecutors, one of whom had extensive history in dealing with domestic violence.
Yes, for the NBA. NHL? Do you have an independent process to investigate the facts?
Under the CBA, we do, yes.
Your own investigators?
Correct.
They're pulling records, they're pulling 911 tapes, all of that?
We have, yes, we have an internal process for conducting investigations on all misconduct, yes.
And Mr. Torrey, by the way, I can't let the hearing be over. I don't know if they put you here because they know how much all of us in St. Louis adore you. But
I was fired.
As you noticed, well, that always happens, right? After you leave, the affection, you know, resurfaces, right? Yeah, I wanted to get that in. As a huge Cardinal fan, you were an important part of our organization in many different ways. So, does MLB yet have an independent investigation process?
Yeah, yes, we do. It's not my department, but we do have a Department of Investigation.
Okay, I would like to know what happened on the investigation on the Rodriguez case. I would like to know what the outcome of that investigation was. I would like to know if they ever asked Mr. Rodriguez if he paid the plane ticket for a victim and the witness to go back to Venezuela.
I'd have to get that information.
Thank you. And does the NFL have its own independent investigation?
Yes, ma'am, we do so with our security department, our internal security department.
Okay. How many of you, yes or no, have an independent program for just wives and significant others where the players are not allowed to attend? Whether it is a confidential, here are the issues you're going to face, here are phone numbers you can call if you're in financial stress, here are phone numbers you can call if you've been abused, here are places you can go for help. How many of you have an independent program like that for spouses and significant others?
Yes, we do. The NFL, we have, yes.
MLB?
Excuse me. Some teams have them. Uniformly, we don't all have them, but it's something that we're
looking at,
developing at this
point.
Okay.
I'll follow up with more questions on that because I want to make sure you get it. Yes?
Yes, I think as Michelle Roberts explained earlier, we in the Players Association have been meeting with our family organizations to determine the best ways that we can provide resources for them going forward.
But you don't have an independent one now?
No.
Okay, because in some of the articles I read, the women were saying there was no place for us to go. The teams weren't calling us. The teams weren't reaching out to us. It was all about the players. And what about NHL?
Our program extends to the players' families, and historically, our program doctors have been accessed by players' spouses and significant others.
But do you have an independent program, for example, for initiation into the league when someone comes? Is there an independent program for the spouse of the player?
To the extent they exist, I think they would exist at the team level. There isn't one that's league-wide.
I would like to have your league look at whether or not there should be a policy that's required. What about mandating reporting to law enforcement? Do any of you have a policy at the league level that a coach is required or an assistant, any team personnel is required if they learn of conduct by a player that is illegal in terms of a felony assault or any kind of assault, that you are required to report that to law enforcement?
Yes, ma'am, we have that in place.
So right now, if a coach, if a player calls his coach and says, you know, I was drunk, got in a fight with my wife, popped her in the face, I just left the house, she's called 911, when he calls that coach under the NFL policy, is that coach then required to pick up the phone and call the police?
That coach is required to do so, yes, ma'am.
Okay, and has a coach ever failed to do that? How long have you had that policy?
It's been in place for some time now. I can't tell you the number of years, but he is required to call.
Okay, well, I'd like to know how many times coaches have called. That's a question I'll have for the record. And I don't have time to ask all of you that, but I will for the record. And I think you get my drift. You all can, listen, I think all of you are terrific people and want to do the right thing. But you've got to understand that the status quo is not acceptable. That turning the other way and thinking that this problem is being handled by these players and their families out of the light, many, many, many families are suffering. And I think you all know that in your hearts. So I'm going to keep following up. There will be more accountability in the future, and I'll have a number of questions for the record, and thank you all very much for being here. I'll turn the hearing over to Mr. Rubio for more questions. If you finish your questions and Senator Rockefeller is not here, you need to recess the hearing because he is coming back? No. Oh, no. So you can gavel out
I
as
just
soon
have
as you're
two
done.
quick questions. I wanted to give Ms.
And
Patterson.
I am going to go vote now, so thank you.
And I won't keep you, but I did want to give you, Ms. Patterson, the opportunity to respond, because Mr. Vincent, in his answer to my question, outlined the role the NFLPA has played in the past in defending players accused of domestic violence or other infractions. What is the NFLPA's role if a player, and so I wanted to lay the groundwork in Mr. Rice's story. Mr. Rice came forward and admitted to the facts to such an extent that we've heard here today that the league didn't even need to see the video to know what had happened. That in essence, they learned nothing new from the video they didn't already know. In a case like that, what is the NFLPA's role in supporting the player, or what role do they play in that process?
First of all, the players have the option to have us in attendance if they have a meeting or a conversation with the commissioner, so we support them in that way. If a player chooses to grieve or appeal after discipline has been handed down, such as in the Ray Rice case, we do prepare that appeal and represent the player on appeal. I think it's worth noting for the record, under the personal conduct policy, that appeal goes back to the commissioner for his review of his own decision. So that is what was different in the Ray Rice case, because we fought for neutral arbitration.
So when these instances in the past where a player, Mr. Vincent outlined the reality where in the past that his testimony today was that the commissioner felt limited by the punishment he could apply to Mr. Rice because of previous instances where he had instituted a punishment and it had been successfully appealed. Who were those instances successfully appealed to? Or maybe, Mr. Vincent, you know the cases that you were referring to when you outlined that in your testimony.
Well, yes. Well, the one that comes to mind is the Brandon Marshall.
Okay. Which Brandon Marshall? Was it the one with the instance down in South Florida with his wife and the?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
And the suspension that was imposed was 3 games, and it was appealed and knocked down to 2.
That suspension was appealed to a independent arbitrator?
Back to the commissioner.
So the commissioner lowered his own decision?
Well, it was appealed. The PA appealed it, and in this particular case, the neutral arbitrator knocked it down to 2 games.
To 2 games from 3. And so based on the Brandon Marshall incident, which as I recollect was an instance where his wife was actually arrested by law enforcement authorities in that case, because he had been stabbed in the stomach with the end of a bottle or something. So my understanding is she was the one that had actually been arrested in that case, although the facts now have turned out to be something different. But, and he has clearly stated that she was not at fault. But in that case, the commissioner's punishment was 3 games, but on appeal from the NFLPA, an independent arbitrator lowered it to 2 games. Do you know for a fact that that's the instance that was on his mind when he settled on the suspension for Mr.?
I wasn't involved in the Ray Rice situation.
Okay. What is it that the NFLPA looks at when it makes these appeals? What are the grounds for an appeal? For example, at what point is it, does the NFLPA have a criteria for where it thinks you go too far in punishing a player because they punch their fiancé in the face?
We don't have criteria. Well, first, we have to see what the player wants to do. And if the player wants to appeal, no matter what our advice is, we have a duty to do so. We represent him in that appeal and we move forward. In the Rice case, it wasn't a matter of the length of the suspension, it was the arbitrariness of the second suspension. We felt that Mr. Rice was in a double jeopardy situation at that point because there was no new evidence that had emerged. So there are different grounds in each case. I hate to say that it's case by case, but unfortunately.
No, I understand the distinction in the Rice case in the sense that he had already received one suspension, and then when the video came out and the world saw what the commissioner already knew, they added an additional suspension, and the NFLPA argued you now have punished him twice for the same thing that you already knew about. I understand that. My question is, moving forward, if God forbid tomorrow morning we awaken to a new Ray Rice type case and a player decides to appeal, I guess your argument is that at that point the NFLPA has the same obligations as a lawyer would to a client.
That's correct.
To defend them irrespective of what its personal views may be about their conduct.
That's correct.
Okay, and so what we don't have is an established precedent in which we know that at some point there is an appropriate suspension that is unappealable. We don't have that set yet. That's what you're working on now.
Yes, sir. Okay. That's exactly what we're working on is a criteria, and the Commissioner spelled that out in his August 28th letter. A minimum with aggravating factors that will allow him to impose more harsh and severe discipline.
Well, could I
yes, ma'am.
respond to that? I would just like to say, again, to some of the earlier points, we'd like that policy to be collectively bargained. I think one of the senators said, you know, we know what happens if a player has marijuana in his system, or we know what happens if, you know, basically if there's a drug policy violation. And this is one of the reasons why, because there is inconsistency, because there is no standard, because neither one of us can give you a criteria for what happens next. That's why we believe this policy needs to be collectively bargained.
I mean, again, I don't want to belabor the point, but there are players that because they've used performance-enhancing drugs, there's some instances involved in, you know, cold medicine that they took without documenting appropriately. They're suspended for more games than Mr. Rice was, and that's why I think the public looks at that and says, this doesn't make a lot of sense to us. But I do want you to know, and again, the NFL-centric nature of it is because I'm more familiar with the league than I am with the operations of other leagues. I think that the takeaway from today's hearing, that to be clear, I think is going to be talked about in the days to come, and for Mr. Vincent, something I think the league is going to have to deal with, is the fact that your statement here today that the commissioner didn't need to see the video because he already knew what had happened. I think that's going to be problematic moving forward. I know many of my colleagues are going to be concerned about that statement as well, because I think some of the perception early on was that, and I was under this perception, that Mr. Rice had not been accurate and honest with the league about what he had done. But in fact, today, the testimony has been that the league fully understood what he had done because there's nothing that we see in that video that he hadn't already told people about. And despite that, the sentence that was handed down, or the punishment that was handed down, was so limited. I know you've admitted to the fact today that the league admits, I should say, that the punishment was not strong enough. But I do think it's going to be problematic for them.
Well, Senator, let me make sure that I am firm and correct on and accurate on what I said. No one needed to see. Again, the commissioner had stated he had not seen the second video. He acknowledged his mistakes on not handing out the proper discipline on the initial round.
Right. No, I understand. And I guess my point on that is that your statement is he didn't need to see the video because he already knew what had happened.
That's my opinion.
Right.
And I think that's the general public's opinion.
Okay. All right. Well, I appreciate all of you being here today. I know it's been a long hearing. Do we have a script for the comments after questions? Or just basically. The record will be open for 2 weeks. And with that, the hearing's adjourned.
Not too bad.